Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to introducing the 2019 State of the IBM Security Study. We're really excited to be here. Another webinar being brought to you by Help Systems, and we're going to give you 6 takeaways for this webinar. I'm Tom Huntington, our EVP of Technical Solutions at Help Systems and a Power Champion for the IBM Power Platform. Just a couple logistics here. This event is being recorded. There will be handouts. There's also a PDF copy of this presentation that'll be available for you too. So with that said, turn it over to Sandi to introduce herself.
Hi, Sandi Moore here, security consultant with Help Systems, and do a lot of security reviews with customers. Really enjoy it and hope to share a lot of good information today with you guys.
Thank you, Sandi. And then, of course, our main person here, Robin Tatam.
Good morning, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here and talk to you about something that is near and dear to my heart, which is a state of security study.
With that said, let's get it rolling, Robin.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start off just very quickly talking about the study itself. It's a little bit different from other studies that are out there. I know, Tom, you're very busy with the marketplace survey that we do,
Right.
but the state of security study is a little bit different. But from a purpose standpoint, there's really 3 main objectives behind this. Number one, we're trying to help management and, of course, the audit community understand if and where there are any security exposures for IBMI. I think all of us here have heard, and I'm sure you have as well, that this platform is intrinsically secure, and so one of the things we want to do is make sure, is that a true statement? And if not, where do we have some exposure? Of course, when we do that, we want to make sure that we're focusing on top areas of concern. It's definitely a regulatory world at this point, but even best practices state we want to understand, but ultimately we need to prioritize those risks into actionable items, and so we want to focus on those top concerns. And then, of course, part of that is developing the plans behind how to mitigate any risks that are discovered. So that hopefully is kind of what you gain from reading this study, understanding the IBMI state of security, and with that, we'll kind of jump into where the data comes from. So we're leveraging a piece of software we refer to as the Security Scan. This is a free product that we make available to people to use for a 7-day window of time, and they can run it on systems. And that scan is intended to sort through the different vulnerabilities or configuration settings that we see, compile them together, and put them into a tangible report that you get to keep. Now, the data that is collected during that scan process is optionally sent to us as well. It's an anonymous submission, so there's no application data, of course, or anything that specifically identifies the organization. But we hope that people do share that data, because that's what fuels the study and gives us real-world insight into how these servers are configured. And it's something we've been doing a long time. The first report was published in 2004. I myself have been doing it since 2009, so this is my 10th year at it.
Wow.
We have done this for thousands of IBMI shops. And
so Robin,
like I said,
how does somebody get started with this?
So the way it's really done is that we leverage the software. We basically have this security scan tool that allows us to see all the settings, right? So that is the first step, and then the data is submitted behind the scenes. If you are interested in either submitting your data or just simply running it to see your own state of affairs, then you can absolutely do this, and we simply provide you with a URL, and we can give you more information for that at the end. Now, there's 7 primary areas of review here. I won't go through all of those just in the interest of time. You guys can read them as well as I can. But really what we've done is focus on the critical areas where we have learned over the years that we see a lot of inconsistency with regards to how the system is often set up. So privileged accounts, system values, of course, the audit functionality in the system. These are all areas that we take a look at and ensure that are buttoned down as well as possible. So with that being said, are you guys ready to jump into some of the details here? We'll talk about the results.
Let's get started. It's very exciting to see.
All right, good deal. Well, this year we had 244 systems in the study. Now, that is up from the prior year, but it's an upper average. That is giving us a pretty good kind of spread of systems. We did look at the geography submissions. The majority are coming from North America, and most common system is a 41A. In the industry that we see most active is in manufacturing. 27% of the surveys or the results came from the manufacturing environment, but certainly all industries are represented. Interesting, 24% of the shops had less than 500 employees, but 18% had 10,000 or more. So we've got a lot of small systems, we got a lot of mid-size, we got a lot of big systems. So really a good cross-section of systems here. I sat and I looked through 300,000 profiles, if you can believe it. Certainly I had some help with that thanks to Excel, but we did slice and dice a lot of information from the profile world, and that breaks down to about 1,200 profiles per system. And then on the application side, we analyzed 135,000 plus libraries. They're the application repositories, and that broke down to about 500 and something on average per system. So you get an idea of how that might compare to your own system. Again, a pretty good smattering across the board. So the first thing, and Tom, I know this is something that you talk about on your marketplace survey, is the currency of the operating system, right? An important aspect. Most regulatory requirements say that you've got to stay supported. And at this point, Tom, where do we stand as far as the released operating systems and their IBM support?
Well, of course, V7R1 and 6.1, when I look at those two, those are two really unsupported operating system for sure. V6R1, 7.1, you can pay that extended contract, but even that is nearing to its end. And of course, right around the corner here, by the time Common is around, or the Power Up 19 event is, we'll have a new operating system out, 7R4, and so that's all coming down the road here.
Yep, and when 7.4 is released, most likely we'll hear of end of life of 7.2. Now, the big reason here is that we want to stay supported so that we can get system updates and patches and things. So regulatory requirements demand that we stay supported. This is a good indication, I think, that people have largely made the transition to supported versions of the operating system. Maybe there's some hardware constraints that hold it back, but this is definitely a good sign. And of course, if somebody was reviewed January 1st, does not mean that they didn't upgrade sometime during the year. So this is a very positive indicator, I think, that people are really staying current. Now, there is also a control that we talk about, which is the system security level. And another positive item here is that 72% of the systems we looked at for 2019 did meet or exceed the recommended security level. But I always remind people that there are other factors that influence not only the benefits, but also the effectiveness of that security level. So we want to definitely target having this overall health indicator show that we are in a good place, but it's not the only thing we need to look at. Now, this control is actually managed by a system value called Q Security. There's 5 settings. The most predominant value is security level 40. That is actually the shipped value from IBM and the recommended setting from most security experts. But we still see a significant portion of systems that are running security level 30 and occasionally systems that are running level 20. Now, we don't have time to get into the nuances of each of them here, but I will apprise you to the fact that most of the people that are running below these level or below the level 40 are really getting there because their system has been migrated from an older one, and when they migrate the data, they also tend to migrate the settings as well. So don't think by going to a new system or new operating system version that this is necessarily going to resolve itself. Even though IBM changed the default, we're still heavily reliant on that migration path. So this is definitely something that you want to take a look at on your system as well.
Rob, and I would think a lot of that might be from the System 36 environments too that came over to the
the level 20 security for sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the good news is if you're on level 30, it's not that hard to get to level 40. You've just got to know how to do it.
And level 40's been around for what, 20 years?
At least, yep. So, Tom, you and I certainly travel a lot for work. This is an Airbus A380. It actually has some power technology on board, although it's actually running the infotainment system. So perhaps not the most important piece of safety equipment, but arguably, as somebody who takes those long hauls, something that I rely on a lot. But the number of sensors in this thing is quite mind-blowing, and all of those sensors are feeding data in a constant form basically to the pilot and flight crew so that they can make determinations as to the airworthiness and the controls of the flight. Now, this is important because without that type of thing, we wouldn't necessarily have the ability to make course adjustments. And this is also true within an IBMI or an IT context, in that if systems are not reporting to us whether there are any health challenges, be it a hardware issue, or if there are security events that are occurring, and we're not gaining visibility to those, things can be happening that are taking us off course or worse, and they could be happening completely under our nose. When we talk about this in an IBMI context, what we're talking about is the ability for the operating system to record events. And the good news is the significant number of systems that are indeed leveraging this has gradually grown over time. So we're currently about 84% of the systems that we looked at last year do have the IBMI audit functionality activated, so recording the events. And I'm happy to see that.
Yeah, I mean, that seems like an impressive number of 84%, but I really wonder, though, how many of them are actually using that information too, though, Robin.
Well, and that's really the pain point, right, is the 84% are, but that still means 16% are completely blind to the events that are happening. Along the lines of what you're saying, Tom, I would offer that 84%, while it's true that the auditing functionality is there and it's active, they're not looking at the data, they're not keeping it the right amount of time, and in many instances, they're not collecting the right kinds of events. So it's not just about turning it on, it's about turning it on correctly. And I know we do have some recorded webinars on the website that talk about that in more depth, but again, an area that I think is easily remediated and is important, because without that visibility, how are you going to know, in essence, if there's something happening on your system that is undesirable?
Yeah, that's a great point, because there are those variables within the Q Audit Journal itself that you can record different levels of information.
Yep, absolutely. So the big question is, if somebody's knocking on the door, they're performing an act that perhaps is less than desirable, would you know if that was happening? In one of the stats that we grabbed off of the data was that one of the servers that was included in the 2019 study had experienced more than 1 million invalid sign-on attempts against just one of their profiles.
Wow, that seems crazy.
Yep, it's staggering, and it's not the highest number I've ever seen. I've had it all the way up over 16 million, but anytime we see, more than 20, I would say that there's a red flag that needs to be waved, and we're obviously in a different universe to that when we talk about 1.3 million here.
Yeah, and I'm an operational guy. I think about the performance impact of that and what that could be doing to the system, and from a performance standpoint alone, without security.
Yep, absolutely. And now the most concerning thing is oftentimes these people are unaware of these events having taken place. In the case of the shop that had 16.4 million, they were completely oblivious to that. The good news for them, in a way, was that they were logging it, but what does that tell you about their visibility to the log if there's 16 million entries and they had completely missed it? So this is really something you want to keep a close eye on. It's not always malicious or nefarious. An application could have become unhinged because the profile password changed, or sometimes we see an IFS drive mapping that's gone haywire. So it's more about the business impact, and like you say, Tom, that can be, simply a performance challenge as well. Now, that one was the standout, but the more important statistic, I think, in my opinion, is that 25% of these servers had all experienced a profile that had more than 1,000 failed connections attempts. And again, that's not likely to be somebody sitting at a desk, so it's an application, which is a business problem, or it's a brute force attack, which is a security problem. Either way, we need to know that this stuff is going on. Now, Sandi, I haven't picked on you too much here, but I know from my perspective, my ideal job description does not include reviewing the audit journal. What experiences have you had with customers around dealing with this type of data?
Yeah, so for the customers we have seen with the audit data being tracked, most of them are not actually using that information. And obviously it's good to have it if you ever have to go back to it, but we'd really like to see that this is being used because it's valuable. Here, you can see with this invalid password entry, you can easily see which user it was, the job that issued that request, and you dig deeper, you can actually even see the IP address. So really being able to take advantage of this information so that they can head off any problems before it gets out of control and they get up to 1 million invalid sign-in attempts, for example.
Absolutely. Now, the challenge, of course, is that this data is frustrating. I always ask people if they've ever looked at the audit journal data, and you always get a knowing chuckle if somebody has, because they know what a mountain of potential events that can be. There's a lot of noise that can be logged. And unfortunately, that's largely a manual reporting process. You have to extract that data out into files and then do queries or write your own programs to do it. So it's not necessarily super intuitive. And of course, it's not in real time. You have to go extract that data. So unfortunately, what we end up with is this proverbial needle in the haystack. And my customer with 16.4 million invalid sign-on attempts completely missed that event was going on. The end result of this is IT often tends to ignore the data, right? At best, they're logging it, and I'm a fan of logging it even if you're not going to look at it, because we can always then analyze it later. But in an ideal sense, if we're going to collect the data, let's get some awareness of what's happening more in real time. We do see customers that tend to get the request from their auditors maybe once a year to provide them with information about their system and maybe the last 30 days worth of system value changes or authority failures, so that they can validate that there were no attacks in the preceding month. But ultimately, when an auditor comes in, and I know this because I tend to do this myself, when we come in, what we're not really attempting to do is look at your system. What we want to know is that you're going to prove to us that you're looking at your system, because when we come in the door, that's just a point in time. We need to make sure that this is an ongoing process, and that there's visibility not just in the one day, but in the 364 days that combine with that.
Yeah, I think really, too, with this whole audit area is what's the norm? And if you're not looking at this information at all, you have no idea on a day-to-day basis what makes sense to your system. And, something might be completely normal, but how do you explain that to an auditor if you're never looking at it?
Agreed. Yep, absolutely. So really for me, automation in some form with this type of data is really the only way to go. The good news is, Tom, you have the name Mr. Robot, right? And
yeah.
You've been around automation for a long, long time. This is definitely in our bag of tricks at help systems to be able to automate this stuff. But even if people are writing their own code, something that allows them to be more proactive with that data rather than find out a year later that, oh, by the way, you had a brute force attack that occurred or an application hasn't been working for the last 30 days.
Well, and a neat thing on this too, Robin, is that when it's set up properly, you end up taking maybe the systems administrator out of the equation, and the internal IT audit team does it themselves if you happen to have one of those teams, or at least the software is set up so that it's just generating the reports for you and you're just looking at the exceptions.
Absolutely. All right, so the next aspect that we want to talk about is the fact that despite at least two of the three people on the phone being old enough that we're used to days of Twin X and dumb terminals, right, Tom? The reality is we're not that way anymore. We have these other colored cables that are going to take us to the outside world, and while majority of IBM systems are internal to the perimeter of the corporate network, there is really no constraints with regards to geographic boundaries or business boundaries for accessing the system. And of course, anytime somebody comes through that perimeter firewall, then in essence, IBM is connected to that world as well. And so we have to acknowledge that the system may see some exposure from that regard. So menuing systems are extremely popular. They date back to the days of the AS400 when it was very simple to put a multi-option menu in front of a user to corral them, control what they do. These menus were very quick and easy to build, and many existing business applications still in use today are relying on these menus really as a convenience item for the user so they don't have to type commands in, but also by the administrator to limit the user access to the background database. When we use menus, we have to make some assumptions. Number one is that the access to the database is only coming through those menus and using the approved applications. We also have to assume that users don't have direct command line permission that would allow them to DFU the file or run query-based tools over it. And this is unfortunate because a lot of those tools are very beneficial. And if we tell the users we just simply don't have security set up in a way that allows you to do that, it's kind of robbing them of that functionality, which is extremely beneficial to database interrogation and in using that information for business decisions.
Robin, if I could throw something into this here is, we do the marketplace study, and in that, only a third of the actual people who respond are truly green screen today.
And that's definitely an evolution that we're seeing gathering steam. When we look at the sessions at Common, there's more and more around open source and other facilities. But if we have control to the database limited by menus, then there's no restrictions on those types of applications, right? So even when we look at big corporate applications, there's a lot of banking apps and hospitality apps that now are providing a more modernized interface that are making ODBC and JDBC connections into the database. Now, when we have menu and application security as the primary control, what we tend to see is that the public permissions to the database are pretty open and permissive. Users still tend to have a lot of power beyond perhaps the business requirement. And I, for one, and Sandi, you can certainly probably speak to this as well, we see a lot of configuration errors in the database. So I put an example here because I saw two systems last week that fell into this category where the users all belong to a group profile, which is fine, but then that group owned all the application objects, which the customer didn't realize meant that indirectly all of their users owned the objects. And as an object owner, you have certain privileges, including setting permissions to the objects. So, it's things like that, even with commercial applications, surprisingly, that we tend to see undermining, in essence, the value that's being brought to the table here. So, Sandi, talk to us a little bit about connecting into the database and how we may be able to control some of this stuff.
Yeah, so the database is open, and what it does is it gives us the ability to connect to it, pull data into PC applications, and interact with that data and see that data, manipulate that data in ways that may not have been intended by the administrators. And so what we want to do is be able to actually see when users are taking advantage of these data connections and manipulating or viewing this data, but also control what they're going to be able to do. Going back to your previous comment and observation on the lack of security around the objects, this really lends to these database connections giving users far-reaching abilities to get to the data. So need to get control over that and start picking and choosing how these users can actually get to the data. And one of those ways is through exit programs, putting controls around the system.
So these tools are really, really easy to use. I mean, this is an example. Granted, it's an older version of Excel, but they make it as simple as possible. And that's a good thing and a bad thing. We want users to have access to the business data when they are in a position to need it. But what we've got to do is ensure that this doesn't become, a sieve of data either leaving the system or, of course, even coming back into the system. And, so that's an area that we really try to focus on. Now, there are Tcp services that I'm sure you're familiar with within the operating system. There was a couple of them that I grabbed here for our discussion today. One is RExec. We're seeing, almost 20% of systems have the RExec server up and running as part of their TCP service configuration. And if you're thinking to yourself, what is RExec? It stands for Remote Command Execution, which means I can go to a DOS prompt and tell the system that you want to run a CL command from there. And that's obviously problematic if you have relied on menus to prevent users from doing that. Now, another interface that is extremely common for use is FTP. This is by default auto-started, and what we find is that the majority of shops leave it that way. Now, I'm not a big fan of FTP when it comes to what's built into the operating system. Yes, it's there, it's fast, it's quick and easy to use, it's honestly like freeware. But when it comes to enterprise level file transfers being done with security, this is not the ideal situation. So the fact that the majority of systems are running this, we need to be extra cognizant of the fact that the given user ID and password, even for green screen purposes, will connect them into this FTP interface and other interfaces as well.
Yeah, so I think the important point here, Robin, is that people can shut these things off if they don't use them.
Well, yes and no.
Really?
FTP, absolutely, they can turn off. Granted, anybody with IOSys config authority can turn it back on, but there are services that you can't shut down because they're used as part of the normal operation of the system. The database servers, for example, can't really be shut down and still have the system functional. So yes, FTP can, others can't. So we've kind of got to find a better way, right? The good news is that methodology is there. So Sandi, you know, I know you weren't around in the 90s, but okay, maybe just. But there's some functionality here that we need to talk about. You mentioned exit points a couple minutes ago. Talk to us a little bit about what this concept is.
Yeah, so IBM has actually provided the ability to use these exit points to put programs in place that actually disrupt a user's connection. And you can actually write a program to check to see if their credentials are valid for that particular service. So essentially creating a firewall around the IBMI where you're able to check users' credentials and allow them to go certain areas that you've deemed appropriate and use certain avenues to get to the system that are appropriate, but keep them from using the other services that you don't want them being able to invoke.
All right, so the exit point is part of the operating system, but the exit program is something additional. So what do we want that exit program ideally to do?
Yeah, so with the exit programs, what we want to be able to do is audit that activity for the appropriate users. So making sure that we are keeping track of when users are taking advantage of these methods of interacting with the system, because IBM doesn't actually include any auditing for these services. So without an exit program in place, you're flying blind. You have no idea which users are using which service and what they're getting to. And then, of course, the controlling the access. So making sure that we put an extra layer around the system because our object level securities are not always great. And it's not flexible enough to be able to say at the object level, hey, user in accounting can get to the system through database server, but not through FTP. So really being able to get that access control in place to make sure that these users are not either harming the system or compromising the data.
Yeah, so even if you have exit programs, you want to be very clear on understanding what functionality they're providing for you to make sure, first of all, they're authorized, but you know, that's where probably the big decision gets made with regards to commercial applications versus homegrown.
Yeah, and with the exit program, you know, you're going to be able to decide whether or not the user gets to use that function, and then you're going to fail that request. The cool part is that you can actually get this control over users who have all objects and get to anything on the system. So we can actually really, with those exit programs, you can ensure that the user is not getting past your controls.
So it seems pretty important that we have these things implemented. What are we seeing in your experience with the customers we talk to? Obviously, the data is showing these numbers here, but is this pretty representative of what you see?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, there's not as many exit programs being implemented as we'd like to see. And, you know, a lot of times there's an assumption that users don't know how to take advantage of these connections. And unfortunately, all it takes is one user to figure it out, and then you have a really big problem. So, you know, we really want to see more companies taking advantage of and implementing exit programs to get some control over these services.
Yeah. So when I talk to customers, I have kind of a 50-50 split of people that were unfamiliar with this concept, and there's webinars on our website about that specifically, and then the other 50% really aren't sure how to implement it or how to go about it, and that's certainly something that we can counsel people about. It is pretty straightforward, and we are seeing, certainly a significant number of systems do have these, although what we're looking at here is a pretty low bar, meaning out of the 20 plus, almost 30 different exit points, we only needed one program being deployed. When we look at all of the programs deployed, that 29% falls back to 8%. So there's still a lot of room for improvement here.
Robin, though, when I look at that, I think about all the customers already that own something from Powertech that's doing the exit point monitoring too. They obviously aren't included in this survey. So there are a lot of people, for those who are listening, going, oh, am I the first? No, you're not the first. There's thousands of customers that use this exit point features already on IBM I.
Absolutely. Yep. And arguably one of the most valuable features because it's a quick win, right? And it's dramatic in its risk reduction properties. So usually the first thing that I say bubbles up to the top of the list. Another area that, of course, is very important is the users and their privileges, because I always joke, well, a server doesn't hack another server, so it's got to ultimately be a user who's doing it. Now, the question is it an authorized user or an unauthorized user? But one of the big challenges from the regulatory discussions that I have is kind of putting a clinical definition around the term powerful or privileged. PCI says, you can only have so many privileged accounts, or, GDPR talks about powerful users on the system, and ultimately they don't tell us what that means. So I'm going to share with you my definition of what is a powerful user, because a lot of people try to define user power or administrative privileges based on the role of the user rather than the privileges assigned to their account. So for me, it could be somebody that has one or more of the 8 special authorities, their admin privileges. It could be somebody who has private permissions to the database or application objects. Robin, you can look at this. Sandi, you shouldn't look at that. But it can also be a server that has permissive public permissions. We're going to talk more about public in a minute, but I'll give you a hint. That is actually most of them. So when we define powerful user, we have a pretty big pool of profiles that we have to include in that. Now, I also tend to acknowledge that there also has to be a way to execute commands or a tool in play that gives direct access to the DB2 database, because without one or other of those two things, then you could argue that the user has power, but they can't use it. Now, I mentioned there's 8 special authorities. The big one is all object. That is a global permission to any object on the system to see, change, delete data, to run or modify or delete applications, and even wipe out the operating system. So this is one we really want to constrain hard. The other thing to know about all object is that it gives you indirect access to the other 7 special authorities. So this one really is the key to the kingdom. Security administrators can manage profiles, they can onboard and provision new users, and so again, that's a very powerful privilege. The IOSysconfig is lines controllers and devices back in the day, but now it's more about the TCP services. So that FTP function, Tom, that you asked about shutting down, an IOSysconfig user can fire it back up again.
I'll say just turn it right back on.
Yep.
Not good.
Audit privileges allow somebody to configure the cockpit voice recorder that I mentioned earlier, extract the data out of that. Not something you typically want having, a lot of people with access to. We want to make sure that there's integrity around that log function. Spool control, the importance of this really depends on what you print, because this is, in essence, the all object of spool files. But if you say, Robin, I don't care what we print, you could set it out on the break room table, it's not a big deal, then spool control is probably going to be less important than if you print payroll or some other type of sensitive data. Just remember, even if you've explicitly said somebody can't access this ALQ, spool control says yes, you can.
Think about the number of people that leave spool files out on the system for years, and it's very sensitive financial data.
Yep, and they're all formatted. So we worry about the data that's somewhat cryptic when you look at the core file, but we format it, we put page breaks, we put column headers and everything, and then we let people see it, right? It's kind of ironic.
Not good.
Service privileges let somebody get into the BIOS of IBM I, so the hardware configuration. Not as high risk as it used to be, thanks to the requirement for credentials to be entered there, but definitely a consideration for not being assigned to too many people. Job control is a privilege that is often assigned to administrators and operators. The intent here is starting and stopping subsystems, workload management, balancing queues, and moving jobs from one to the other. There's some interaction here with spool files as well. So we tend to see people being given this permission for pretty benign tasks like starting a print writer. And unbeknownst to the administrator, what they've also done is inadvertently granted permission to bring the system down into a restricted state. So we've got to find some kind of balance there. Now, one of the most misunderstood ones is save sys. This is a permission that lets you create a media save of any object on the box, even objects that you wouldn't normally have business access to. Now, if I copy something, in essence, to media, then I can potentially restore it somewhere else, maybe to another system or another library, and now I have access. I can view it, I can download it, I can perhaps even change it and back it up and restore it over the top of the original. So a very, very powerful privilege, and one that even allows a user to potentially archive, i.e. delete, data from production files. So this is arguably one of the most misunderstood or least understood special authorities out there, but one that you definitely want to have on your radar. So the big question is, how many actual admins do you have? I mean, this is something that, again, when we define based on the number of privileges on a profile, may differ from the people in this role. But when we look at the types of folks that should be running with these privileges, are we talking 1? Are we talking 20 or 30?
Robin, you know, when you look back at the marketplace study, again, I hate keep bringing that up and correlating numbers, but you know, over 40% only have one admin person. So why do they have hundreds of all object?
Absolutely. So that's actually, I'm glad you do bring that up, because the marketplace survey is extremely valuable when we dovetail it with the security study, because as you said, there are hundreds of these accounts out there that are running with these special authorities that really just don't have a justification for doing so, right? So 168 users on average. That's not a total across the study. That's on average on each system running with the keys to the kingdom. Bearing in mind, I can see any data. I can even delete the operating system with that privilege. But look at spool control and job control. Almost 500 profiles apiece. I mean, it's staggering.
That is.
Arguably, spool control may be less important to certain customers, but job control should be important to everyone. Same thing with save sys. That kind of snuck up on us this year. So it's important that you have a good, firm understanding of what these privileges are, and talk to us if you do find that you have a lot of them about methodologies for removing this, because arguably the reason it looks like this, Tom and Sandi, and I think you'll agree, is because most people are fearful of taking away a privilege that's going to break something as far as their business process.
Yeah, you know, last week, Robin, I had a customer that said, I'm like, talking to him, I'm going, oh, this is going to be a problem for him. He says, no, I only have 5. And he had thousands of users on his system and only 5. So people can do it.
It can be done. I do occasionally see it. It's not very often, but we do see it, and so I know it can be done. All right, let's touch on what I call insider threat. Now, pretty much any breach out there ultimately ends up in somebody from outside coming through to the inside. But what we're talking about specifically here are people that are, in essence, authorized to be on the network, maybe with or without access to the IBMI. Now, this is an expensive function. An insider attack has a median loss of about $4 million US, and half the victims don't ever get that back. So it's a quick and easy way to burn money. And arguably, the part of the reason for this is the detection period for an insider breach is very extended. We were joking a little bit earlier about the weather in Minnesota, but you know, winter may last for the better part of 18 months, right, Tom? But reality is, when you think back about 18 months from now or 18 months in the past, granted, it's going way faster for me than it was 20 years ago, but that's a long time for somebody to be on the system flying under the radar.
And that's the crazy thing about all these breaches that do happen. It's often, months and maybe years that go by before people realize they were even breached.
Yeah. So we see the breach news releases, and they tend to say, hey, we think this has been going on for the last 3 months. Invariably, they'll come back and they'll amend that, and now it's it's been going on since last year. And so we don't ever see somebody come back and say, oh, we thought it was worse than it actually was. It's usually the other way around. Now, when it comes to insiders, of course, we've got to control their access. We've got to validate that the person has permission to access the system, and traditionally the way we do that is through passwords. And IBMI, of course, supports that concept. So the big question, of course, is how well are we doing? Well, one of the most important factors around password strength is the length of the password. And traditionally, we kind of took best practices as being about 6 characters long. What we've seen recently is kind of a push to 7 characters and even 8 characters or longer. But interestingly, this year we saw a significant increase in the number of systems that were running subpar. So number 5 there, 5 character long, is the most prevalent value. But I read an article from an IBM VP just a few weeks ago that talked about the fact that they can crack 6, 7 character passwords in literally a matter of minutes now. And part of that is going back to the fact there's been so many data breaches involving credentials that the bad guys have really built up a pretty significant dictionary of previously used passwords. So they're not really breaking the password, they're just trying lots of combinations until they find one that works. Now, the password expiration period is a little bit controversial. National Institute of Standards and Technology, that gives advice to the federal government about best practices, in essence, used to say that this needed to be done, and they've somewhat recently backed off, saying no need to change a password unless there's suspicion of it having been breached somewhere along the line. Interestingly, we saw that conveyed here in the data. On the right side there, we see 105 systems that were not requiring a password expiration, at least at a system level. A lot of people also doing it 60, 90 days. Now, even though NIST says not that important, I actually don't agree. And the reason for that is I know users tend to recycle passwords across multiple uses. And so how am I going to know as a corporate enterprise that somebody who uses the same password on Pinterest didn't have their password compromised, and now I have exposure through my VPN? So I'd rather err on the side of caution, simply because I can't anyway enforce that a password is unique.
Yeah, there you go. Notice they're on Pinterest, and then, oh, by the way, they work for Help Systems because they're liking the Help Systems Facebook page, right? And so now they try to get our company.
Yep. Digit requirements within the password always kind of fall 50-50. Some people think it's a good idea, others not. I kind of have mixed feelings about it. The concern I always have with the digit is that there's a reduced character set. So instead of 26 letters in the English characters, we have now, in essence, 10 digits. So are we making it easier? And even though we do password construction that we try to think of as being complex, when we look at passwords like this and we go, yeah, that's a good password, nobody's ever going to guess that, you're probably right. They won't guess it. It also is something that I'm probably going to struggle to remember. Not that I don't know the word troubadour behind the scenes, but did I do a 3 or a B? Was it an uppercase T or a lowercase t? So it's still kind of hard to remember. And unfortunately, the risk that we run is that if somebody tries to brute force this, it's no more difficult than if I just use the word troubadour, most likely, right? Interestingly, if we go with longer passwords, in other words, we're transitioning to passphrases, we get a significant increase in the strength of the password. So something that is maybe 3 words randomly strung together like this could be very beneficial. The entropy of this type of password, which is the measured strength, is significantly better. It's much easier to remember. I would offer, once you come up with something pretty weird like this, it's going to stick in your mind. And a lot of us are using password managers anyway, so copying and pasting is no big deal. It's also difficult to guess, so we still get the benefit of that. But when it comes to brute force cracking of a password like this, pretty strong. Of course, if it's breached and used in other places, we still have the same issue, so making them change it on occasion is still my suggestion, but ultimately longer is definitely better in this regard, and it tends to freak users out when they first think about this, going, oh gosh, I've really got to remember that long of a password, but look at it. I think it's easier to remember. The other thing we've got to think about, too, is that, honestly, passwords are not that great. Passwords can be compromised. They can be shared. They can be written down. There's always the joke about, the Post-it note under the keyboard, and unfortunately, we do see that. I even have a picture of a system from a friend of mine where he went in and found the QSEC offer password on a Post-it note stuck to the front panel of the system. So we know that that is pretty prevalent. So one of the options that we have is to think of things like multi-factor authentication, where we're not only validating the knowledge that somebody has of the password, but we're also providing some authentication of their identity as well. Two-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication, something that perhaps we talk about and is a concept that you may have heard but not fully understand. But I always take it back to a simple cash machine. You go to the ATM, you have a card in hand, that's your physical asset, and you have a PIN number that you have in your mind that hopefully you haven't shared with anybody. But even if you have, without the card, it's not going to give them access. So the combination of those two things can be very, very beneficial. Now, a significant control, a very important control that we can leverage within IBMI is to restrict the number of sign-on attempts that we permit a user to perform before some type of act is or reaction is taken. So the most common, of course, 3, 4, 5, 6, not bad. This is going to ensure that a brute force attack is most likely going to fail, because unless they happen to pick the known password or the actual password in the first of those attempts, they're not going to get in. But look on the right there, guys. We've got 10 systems that are configured as allowing unlimited numbers of sign-on attempts. So ultimately, I can sit all day, every day, just hammering away until I get signed on to the system. And if that was our 1.3 million, then we know that we've got a real issue here.
And such a simple change, really, Robin, when you think about it. One of those
absolutely.
parameters that has no impact on the business, and you could throttle this down and set it at 10 like somebody has here, and you're so much better off.
Well, you can actually go up to 25 before you have to go to Nomax, and kind of controversially, I tell people I'd rather you have 25 and at least have a cap, because the mindset that people have with the Nomax is, you don't understand my users. They are not very sophisticated, and I take a lot of calls to my help desk. And I offer, okay, then make it 25, because if somebody doesn't get on in that many attempts, they don't know their password, right? So even if you have a high limit, at least it is a limit. And I think that's really, really important.
It's like your credit card. Do you really want an unlimited balance?
No, I definitely do not. The action that we take when those attempts are exceeded gives us really three choices here. We can disable the device, we can disable the profile, or we can disable both the device and the profile. I love the disable profile option. We want to take that account out of the running. Disabling both accomplishes that as well, so I have no issue. But the disabling of the device is a concern, and when I come across this, I have to explain to people that if you are disabling a device and only doing that, and somebody tries to brute force an FTP connection or an ODBC connection, which, let's face it, is most common way for somebody to be attacked is through a common PC interface, disabling the device is actually not going to do anything because there is no device. So the knowledge that even if we don't have unlimited sign-on attempts, but if we don't react in a way that does something useful, then we have significant exposure here as well. And 10% is a pretty large number of systems to fall into that. All right, so a couple of other stats around profiles. Significant number of user profiles, on average 182, 89 enabled, have a password that matches the name of the profile, right? So we talk, okay, I said trying to brute force your way in, and if we lock them down in 3 attempts, I would argue one of those attempts is most likely going to be the name of the profile. So even with your limit set there's a very good chance that they will actually succeed. Now, I'll grant you that that number is a little skewed, partly because one system we looked at, guys, had over 12,000 profiles on it with a default password. How mind-blowing is that?
Oh,
the good news is that only 3,700 of those were in an enabled state ready for use.
Wow.
So they disabled some, but ugly, ugly, ugly. Now, we want to make sure, of course, that this isn't the system that had unlimited attempts allowed on it, right? Because I guarantee at some point that connection would be successful. Another area is when we have dormant profiles, right? They go to sleep and there's no need for them anymore. 30 days of inactivity is what we measured. We found 438 profiles on average fell into that bucket, 295 of those enabled, so a good chunk of them. I get that a lot of people are leaving these profiles on the system nowadays, and that's fine, but we have to acknowledge that if they don't need to be there, let's at least cripple them or ideally get rid of them. A lot of users are still able to run commands. We talked about menus earlier, but 346 profiles can run commands on a green screen command line. That's way beyond the administrators plus programmers that could probably justify that fact. So this is an easy way for somebody to compromise a system. And for those that don't have command line, as we stated earlier, some of them may be able to run commands through PC interfaces. So QShell, SSH, and RExec and FTP all allow commands in some capacity to be run even if you don't have limited capabilities. Now we talk about public in IBMI, and this is really just a reference to any user that doesn't have all object, because if they have all object, it doesn't matter, they're in, and those that don't have any explicit permission to objects. And PCI and other regulations have zeroed in on this. We talk in PCI about requiring what's called a deny all model, but there is a warning there that you see on the right-hand side that says some operating systems and access control systems are configured the opposite of that. And shockingly, IBMI is the one we're being warned about. That has a default permission associated with public access, and what we see here is most systems are leaving it untouched. Now, IBM sends this to you with a star change permission pre-established, but the only one that's going to keep somebody out is star exclude up at the 10 o'clock position there. There's only 9% of application libraries out there that are configured to keep people out. Okay, now the library is only one part of this. The object inside is relevant as well. So when we talk about the object permissions inside those libraries, what we see is that the configuration tells us that most objects are being created with a public permission of change. That's either explicitly granted by the library, or the decision is deferred back to a system value, and the system value is commonly left at that change setting. So, in other words, creating objects happens a lot, but we don't tend to ever override the settings and change it. So when we talk about a permissive system, this is why. Well, hopefully you never see this on one of your green screens, but I'm sure that you've at least encountered people that have seen it on a PC. And what we have to talk about is how important is a virus malware discussion to the IBMI platform. And Sandi, I think you are one that has been around this probably more than anybody. This is a real thing, right?
Absolutely. This is a customer system that got attacked by ransomware in their IFS and ended up with 500,000 files encrypted on their system, and actually they had 248,000 copies of that ransomware resident on their IFS after that attack. So
wow. So the IFS, the file structure that we all love to hate, very beneficial. It's part of the operating system. It can host viruses that will spread outbound, but it can also be impacted by viruses that are acting on objects that are there. So even the native structures that are virus resistant can be deleted and renamed. So don't think that you get a free pass because you're running on IBMI. The good news is that the operating system has AV functions in it, but what we're seeing is about 11% of systems are using that as a technology. Now that's an increase on prior years, so I'm excited to see that, and I know discussions are becoming more common. People are accepting this fact, but there's room for growth here. So if you are mapping drives, or if you have HA systems, this is a very relevant discussion, and we can certainly guide you through that. But a positive result here. Still room for improvement, of course. So part of the discussion here, of course, is that we want to give you some takeaways. So I'm going to run through the 6 takeaways that I have from this data. First of all, Sandi gave us an explanation of the exit points and exit programs. It's critical that we police this perimeter, especially in light of the fact that object-level security is severely lacking for most of us. This is a quick win. It's a huge way, or a huge risk reduction, in a quick way to gain the benefits without necessarily investing in a tremendous amount of time to re-architect your application environment. The second takeaway here is that we want to be better about restricting user access to the database. That might be a combination of command line permissions. It could be exit programs, of course, so that they can't run them through the PC interfaces like RExec. But there needs to be some control. Even if you are not going to clean up the privileges, we want to make sure that they can't exercise these unless there is a specific business requirement.
On that particular one, Robin, we could encrypt the data at rest too. I mean, we have the ability to do that, and if
Absolutely.
somebody needs that, we can take care of that for you.
Yeah, for sure. The IFS I've mentioned, we want to make sure that we're controlling access. Again, that has an exit point associated with it, so an exit program can do a nice job here, but we should also be scanning these file systems for viruses, leveraging the OS functionality that has been there since V5R3. You just have to add the scan engine, and I know, the 11%, a good number of those are running the Powertech antivirus engine, and we can certainly give you information about that. We want to review those system values. So many of them come from IBM in a default state, and that doesn't mean they're in the right state. So we have to review them. Then we want to baseline them and make sure they stay consistent. So we talked about Q security, but there are several dozen others that pertain to security, and we want to make sure that they are all good. Now, our user access policies pertain to good password strength, considering single sign-on, maybe multi-factor authentication, and all of these things come together to make sure that we are ensuring that the people connecting to our system have a reason to be there and they are who they say they are. And my last tip, or my last takeaway here, is that we are seeing a growing understanding of the necessity for good security, not only on IBM I, of course, but across the entire IT ecosystem. People in the Windows world have known this for a long time. We're playing a little bit of catch up in the Power Server world, but it's important that we take advantage of this kind of newfound interest. Get in front of your management team, get budget assigned to ensure that this system is not left out in the dark, and that we have good security practices here, because it is a critical system, of course, for most of us. So my call to action here is, 5 bullets. I'm not going to go through all those because I know we're coming up on the top of the hour, but really it just breaks down. And in the most important one to me, get some kind of assessment done, right? Before you start trying to fix things, get a health check. You don't go and have surgery unless you've been to your general practitioner first, or at least I hope you wouldn't. So why do we do that in the IBM I world? So the security scan is free. You can take advantage of that. Or if you've had an assessment done, just make sure it's by somebody who knows the platform well. There's lots of things that can be done without a huge impact on the system. Certainly there are longer term items as well, but there are many things that we can do to effectively reduce the risk in short order, and we can help you with that, walk you through it. The security scan is a great way to kind of dip your toe in the water. There's no cost associated with this. It's quick and easy to do, and we'll even go through the findings with you. Take about an hour or so, and we don't charge for our time either. So not only is the use of the tool free, but the expertise behind it comes to you as well. We've really ended up with a perfect storm of vulnerability in IBM I, and it's time to kind of break that cycle. Awareness amongst IBM I professionals about security is generally pretty low, but unfortunately, IBM I awareness amongst those that know security or audit is even lower, so we don't have anybody holding us accountable. A lot of valuable data stored on the platform. Of course, you guys are here spending time with us, so assume that it is a key part of your IT infrastructure. But unfortunately, most of that data is not secured, and the users that are accessing it are far too powerful, and those are dangerous combinations. This information is easily accessed through the PCs, many instances, no oversight. And again, if you're going to be hacked, it's going to be through those PC interfaces where people don't necessarily know or care that they're connecting to a Power System server. All right, guys, so that is some of the data extracted from the State of Security study. Go ahead and download that. In fact, I think we may be sending it out to you, so hang tight. We'll make sure that we'll make it easy for you. You guys have spent the time. You've paid the piper here. Let's make that easy and get it over to you. But 16 years now of insight. We'd love to help you with any security initiatives you have. We're out here. We've got really good resources. Tom, you're an IBM champion. I am as well. There's only 39 of them worldwide, and we've got 3 of them here at Help Systems. So that's,
one of
that's exciting.
One of the things I was thinking about, Robin, was if somebody is struggling with their on-site object security and those things, we also do professional security services around that. We can help you reconfigure that and coach you through that process. It might not be Robin, but we have a whole nother team of security professionals that help with implementation and services.
Yep, right here. Carol Woodbury, yeah, she's another IBM champion. So that's the 3rd out of the 39, all working for Help Systems. So what a story that we have the pleasure of being able to tell every day. All right, so that's the end of the content. I appreciate everybody spending a little time with us here. I'm going to hang for a few minutes and see what questions we have. I know there were a couple that rolled in here, but let's see. Somebody asking about a license for the security scan and whether we can do that on an ongoing basis. Bottom line is the tool is not intended as a long-term remediation or assessment tool. It's a good way of getting a health check. There's a lot of other components within our portfolio that we would bring to bear that are going to give you the necessary granularity and detail behind the system scenes so that you can make good decisions. What we're talking is more statistical in the security scan, so it's a good start, but I wouldn't necessarily stop there. All right.
Well, Robin, Tom Huntington here. Just want to say thank you on behalf of Help Systems to all the customers that have joined us today. We are right at the top of the hour. We'll certainly follow up with you on your questions that you have in the chat today. And Sandi, want to thank you too. If you want to have a great experience with Security Scan, have Robin or Sandi help you out, and they'll walk you through the process.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.